So my name is Jessica Rorson, and I'm working with Sage Hill Community Futures, helping them coordinate some of these webinars. And today we have Trevor King, who lives in Rostern, and he is with Prairie Paget. And today he's going to be talking about GST and PST. And we've had Trevor on here several times before, and he's great and completely open to questions either during this session or in the chat or even afterwards. I'm happy to forward his contact information to everybody. So before we get started, I just wanted to read a land acknowledgement. As we gather here today, we acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. So Trevor is living in Rostern, but he is away with his family. So he is, we're really thankful for virtual sessions because really people can be all over the world and it doesn't matter and we can still connect. So thanks, Trevor, for joining us, and please take it away.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. As Jessica said, I'm Trevor King. I'm one of the managing partners of Prairie Paget Tax and Accounting Limited in Rostern. Basically, what we're going to do today is we're going to do an overview of GST and PST. I mean, it's pretty tough in 45 minutes to get in deep into either subject, but this will give you a pretty basic overview of how GST and PST works and where you stand as a business owner with regards to what are your responsibilities with GST and PST. Now, I always like to start them with a question. So when did GST come into effect? Does anyone actually know?
No.
No. Okay. So GST came into effect January 1st of 91. It replaced the federal sales tax, which it's been around since the early 1920s, which, like income tax, was supposed to be a temporary thing. But I think the government got a taste for the money, and that's where we're at now. So I have a presentation I'm going to go through with here with you guys. Everyone see this?
Yes.
Yes.
Turn my video on there. Just got to turn my screen so I can actually see both of them. Okay. If you guys have any questions, I mean, feel free. You can stop me if we're right in the middle. You can just wait till I stop for a breath and then ask your question, or type it in the chat. Or if it's something you're not comfortable asking, Jessica will share my email as well as the email for my office manager here. You can fire us any question, and that stuff's all confidential. So let's see if we can get through this. GST and PST is not the most exciting subject I talk about, but we'll see what we can do. Okay, so the basis of GST, what an input tax credit is, collection and remittance, purchase exemptions with regard to PST, and then your basic remittance and filing dates, and what you need to do and why those are important to keep track of. Right? If you miss your filing date, you're subject to a fine, interest, penalties, as well as any other kind of punishment the government will enforce upon you. So GST is basically all taxable sales are subject to it. Once you apply for a GST number, now there is something called the small supplier model, where if you're under $30,000 in a quarter, you're not required to apply. Or if you're considered a small supplier for PST, it's under $10,000. So when you start your business off, you'll be quite small, right? If you don't hit those income minimums, and that's not net, that's gross sales, right? So that's before any of your expenses or anything. You don't have to apply, but once you're over $30,000, you're required to charge and collect GST. Now, the thing is, and this is what I tell a lot of clients, is you're better off, if your business is growing, you're better off to apply for a GST number in the beginning of the year. You know, look at your projections from last year, look at what you're doing, look at how much you're growing, right? Oh yeah, okay, so we'll hit the, you know, in Q2, we're probably gonna be over the amount we need for the year. Then I would apply for a GST number before you hit that threshold, just because it's way easier if you have a clean start and stop for accounting. When you go through a quarter, those are the calendar quarter, so January, April, July, and October. Now, the other thing you can do, and I have this in my speaker notes, it's not part of the presentation on the slides, but if you're dealing with the federal government, you want to apply for government grants, you want to apply for government contracts, and this is specifically with the federal government, you're going to need a GST number. They won't even take your submission if you want to apply for a contract without a GST number. So you can apply, and what you do is you say, I want to voluntarily register for a GST number. You also get to take advantage of input tax credit, but we'll get into that later. But from that point on, you'll be issued a GST number from the government, and then you can start to bid on government grants, government contracts, as well as it'll add some legitimacy to your business when you do your invoicing up, right? I'm going to pick on Jessica. I'll use her as an example. You know, Jessica Rorenson, right, has her name across her invoice and then has her GST and PST number listed. You get an invoice from someone like that. You say, okay, yeah, this person's obviously, you know, more legit than a handwritten note on the back of a napkin, right? So it adds some legitimacy to your business. Ooh, go back. Right. So we'll get into, can anyone tell me what an input tax credit is? Don't everyone talk at once. No? Okay. Input tax credits. When you buy something for your business, you go out, you say, oh, I'm going to start a consulting business. Okay, so I buy a vehicle, and then I need a computer and a printer, cell phone. Everything you buy, you're subject to GST. So you registered for a GST number because you know I'm going to hit that threshold, no problem. You can actually claim back all of the GST that you paid out on those items when you go to file your GST. That's what an input tax credit is. Or if you're in the retail trade, you can be PST exempt if you're buying items for resale, but you'll always be subject to GST, right? It's called an in and out tax. So you'll pay it when you buy a product at wholesale, and then when you go to sell it, you'll also charge GST on the resale amount. Now, this is where people, especially when people are first starting out, this is where you get into trouble. Is say you get 9 months into your business. You're like, oh, business is going good. I got to apply for a GST number October the 1st. You can't claim anything that you've paid in January to October of that year for your business. You can't claim any of that GST back. Now, with every rule, there is an exception. So if you continued on your business and didn't apply for a GST number, and then the following year you go to apply for one, you say, you know, I actually hit the threshold in October. Sometimes, and I will say this sometimes because it really depends who you get when you ask for a GST number. Sometimes GST numbers will be backdated. And the reason that I've run into this is I ran into it with a farm client who had hit their GST threshold and then never applied for the number, got audited, and the government said, well, geez, you should have had a GST number years ago. So now we're in the process of going back and finding all the GST they paid, which is good for the client. but there, you know, with every rule, there is an exception. But if you get issued a GST number, oh, excuse me, your GST number starts on January 1st of 2023, and that's the date they issued, and that's the date you're given, you can't go back, right? So it has to be within the period the number was issued. Now, where people get into trouble is, what portion of GST do I claim, right? If you're a small business, odds are you'll be a sole proprietor. You're claiming a bit of mileage on your vehicle, for example, and you purchased that vehicle while you had a GST number. How much GST do I claim? You can only claim a proportional amount. You don't get to claim it all, right? Unless it was bought 100% for business use.
Trevor, if you buy a car and you have car payments, is there GST on that?
No, because your payments,
it's a finance thing, right?
it's a finance deal, right? So your GST amount when you bought the car, whether you use dealer financing or bank financing, the car was paid for in full. Now you're repaying the loan.
Right.
So the GST would have been paid the day that you signed for it.
Okay.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions about input tax credits?
No.
Is there anything in the chat, Jessica? No.
No.
Okay.
Chantel, did you have something to say? You kind of.
No,
No?
I didn't have
Okay.
any questions.
Okay.
All right.
So now this is the other thing. Sometimes people will get behind on their GST. Now, this doesn't mean that you can go, if you go 4 years without paying GST, you're in the clear. That is not what this means. This is if you're owed money from the government from your GST claim, you have 4 years to claim it. If you owe them, you still have to pay them. Right? You can claim some input tax credits, but if it's more than 4 years, you're not getting a refund. They'll say your credits have expired. That is a not very well known thing about GST. Nope. There. Okay. Now, when you're building your invoices, and most people don't realize what's required on an invoice, it depends how much money a year you're doing your sale for. These are in thousands of dollars, right? So if you're under 30,000, you need a name, a date, you know, total amount paid or payable. Once you get over 30 grand, there are some other requirements, right? And then over $150,000 is when you get into, and these are amounts you do per year, not per invoice, right? So if you do one invoice for 45,000, one invoice a year, you'd still have to meet all these requirements. Oh. So the interesting thing is, once you get over $150,000 a year, is having representatives and then terms of payment. Oh. So terms of payment, sometimes, and you'll see this often on suppliers' invoice when you first get started, they'll be like, due in 30 days, but they'll give you a discount if you pay within 10 days, right? It's a way for suppliers to keep their cash flow rolling forward and not have so much tied up in receivables. But that's more of when you get into, you know, you're ordering big amounts from your suppliers, if you're in a retail trade, companies that sell auto parts sometimes will do this. They'll have terms of payment when it's due and if there's a discount period available. So zero rated supplies. So these are the items. They say everything is subject to GST with these exceptions, right? I'm not going to read them all to you. You guys can all read. But the basic is the other thing is if you're engaged in what's called interlining. Interlining is the transport of agricultural equipment. You do not charge GST. It's you pay your GST and then you can collect your tax credits back. If you leave it for more than 4 years, odds are you're not going to get it. But file your GST on time, and you'll be fine. Your basic groceries, those are all GST exempt, as well as most farm items are also GST exempt, right? So farmers love GST. They pay it throughout the year and then they get to collect it back at the end. Again, this list is very extensive. So Jessica's going to share the presentation if you guys want to go through it. I think we'd get much more out of this by talking through at the end if anyone had some questions or had a hypothetical scenario they wanted to go through. Right now, well, can't read that part. This is where, and I've seen a lot of clients get into trouble with this over the years. If you're registered for GST, right, you're authorized by the government to collect that money. That's not your money. I'm going to say that one more time, just so everyone gets it. When you charge and collect GST, it's not your money. I definitely recommend setting up a separate account, right? Because once you get to the point where you're making enough where you have to collect GST and PST, I recommend a computerized accounting system. There's lots of different products out there. You can use Excel if you want. That's the easiest and cheapest way to do it, but it is all manual entry. But you need to figure out how much of your revenue is GST and put it away in a separate account. Otherwise, you come to the end of the year, and if you had a really good year, you're going to get hit with a pretty big GST bill. Same thing goes for PST. You charge, collect your PST, goes in a separate account. It's not your money. Okay, that is the if all you do once you get registered for GST and PST, all you do get out of this is you remember to put the money away, your issues with GST and PST will be fairly minimal, right? That is the number one thing that catches people in the end, right? Because they get, especially early on, you're in a growth stage, you've got a lot of capital expenditures. It seems like money's running out the door just as fast as it's coming in. You need to make sure end of the month. I know what we do is we just run a liability statement, like we use QuickBooks to run our business. How much did we charge in GST last month? Oh, it's X amount. Okay, transfer it. Go into our online banking, transfer it over. What did we do for PST last month? Okay, it's this much. Transfer it over online banking. And it just sits there and you don't spend it. And what I found is if you set aside all of the GST you've charged, when you get to the end of the year, you claim your input tax credits, and the input tax credits are your credits. So you'll actually have money left over in that liability account, right? Probably will have to go towards paying your business income taxes, but it'll give you a little bit of a buffer. Okay, does anyone have any questions with GST, setting up remittance, what a tax credit is, and how that works? No. Okay. if you're shipping stuff outside of Canada, GST doesn't apply. The rated and exempt services, financial advisors don't charge GST. Insurance advisors don't charge GST. Goodwill is something that's very hard to define, but it's basically when you buy a business, you buy the name and you buy the reputation, and the reputation is the goodwill. Goodwill is not subject to GST. Now, reporting periods. And I mean, you got to be pretty big to have quarterly reporting periods. You got to do more than 1.5 million a year. And that's before they force you to go to quarterly reporting. If you do have a fairly significant business and you do want to keep your liabilities to a minimum, I recommend that most people use quarterly remittance for their GST. Yeah, you got to do it 4 times a year, but it's not so much money going out the door at once. Right, so the difference between an assigned and an optional. Assigned reporting period is what CRA is giving you, and optional is up to you. Some people like to do monthly GST reporting. I think it's a little excessive, but if you're doing a fairly good bit of business, then it's entirely up to you. Okay. Now, and this is where remittance dates can get confusing. So if you go with a quarterly or monthly remittance, it's due a month after your reporting date. If you go annually and you're on a calendar year, you have to make your payment by the 30th, but you got to file. You can file as late as the 15th of June. What does that mean? Why would I pay before I file? Basically, this is specifically for farmers, right? They got to pay their GST before April 30th if they have any GST to pay. And then because their taxes are done later in the year, you have to file it by June 15th. You can pick your own fiscal year end with GST. It's 3 months after your year end, your GST is due. I recommend usually try and do it within a month afterwards, because if you're doing GST and PST, they both PST has to be done within the month. Right, so if your PST year end is December 31st, by January 20th, you have to paper file it, and you have up until the 31st to electronic file it. But just get in the habit of doing it the month after your year end. Year end's done. Okay, we're gonna close our books up. We're gonna reconcile everything. Here's how much we owe for GST. It's sitting in the account. Just go through your net file system, put your net file number in. It's a sheet they'll mail you when you register for GST. It's very important. Do not lose that access code. It's a little 4-digit code in the top right-hand corner of a GST form. Once you file it, go in and pay it. Always print copies of your receipts when you pay GST. Just like anything, record keeping is the backbone of a business. If you don't have good records, it's very difficult if you ever get into a dispute to prove anything. Does anyone have any questions on remitting GST to Revenue Canada? You can mail them a check if you want. They'll still take it. It just takes a long time.
Having just done that, I thought it was quite nice how it connected right to your bank account. So you don't need to you can do it walks you right through it.
Oh, they're efficient. The Revenue Canada is very efficient at getting your money. It's really good that way. Oh, I got something in the chat.
Oh, if the period ends on a weekend, do you have to file during the weekday?
So Elaine, if your filing period ends on a weekend, like ends on Saturday. It's just like a stat. It's the next business day. So if it ends, say, I don't know, let's go to my calendar here. Let's use December 31st. So December 31st was on a Saturday. So if your year end came and went and your filing date was December 31st, you had up until January 2nd to file. It's the next business day. They'll give you that little extension. I mean, I wouldn't recommend leaving it right until the last minute, but I also understand that when you're busy running a business, sometimes this stuff can get left up until it really needs to get done. Does that answer your question, Elaine? I'm sure she'll type back.
She said sort of.
Sort of. Okay. Oh, I see what she means. Sounds good. All right, we're going to continue on. Great. So what do? I get to the end of the year and I haven't taken Trevor's advice and I haven't put money aside. First thing, there's a saying about a creek and a paddle. That's where you are. Make arrangements right away with Revenue Canada. Call the GST helpline, right? They'll do their security checks and you'll jump through a bunch of hoops and you'll probably get connected to 2 or 3 different people. And this is my advice whenever I deal with GST, right? I can come off as aggressive and abrupt at times, but when I'm dealing with CRA, I'm polite, I am nice. Yeah, sure. Oh, you've been on, no, I'm sorry, you've been on hold. Yeah, I've been on hold for like 4 hours. Yep, that's true. I have been on hold for 4 hours. Taking it out on them is a surefire way to get them to not help you. Make sure that you make arrangements, right? You know, I'm going to make payments on my GST. You know, if you're making payments and you can demonstrate that you're trying to get caught up, a lot of times those fines and those fees are negotiable, right? They can say, well, you know, if you get caught up in the next 3 months, we'll waive half your fine. Okay, perfect. Sounds good. Because the last thing they want to do is try and take you to collections over GST. Right? There's other ways. They'll withhold tax refunds until your GST is filed and paid. Right? But as long as you're working with them and you can demonstrate that you're trying to meet your obligation, because you've got to remember that GST money was not yours to begin with. That's government money you're holding on to. And ensure in the future that we set up a tax account. Typically, if you're using online banking, if you use just a savings account, most banks will let you set up a savings account for free. Just put your tax money in there and don't spend it, right? It's not for capital investment, it's to pay the government. Does anyone have any questions about getting up the creek without a paddle? No? Okay. Now, I'm sure everyone has seen this on their Netflix charges. You got to pay GST on that now. It's an extra 5%. Same with Amazon. Same with anyone who has Airbnbs or VRBOs in Canada. You've always had to charge GST on commercial rent. Like if you have storage units, if you have a commercial shop, if you have commercial office space, you got to charge 5% GST, tuck it aside, and then give it to the government at the end of the year. This is another way. Basically, what the government found was they were losing an incredible amount of money because 5% of everyone's Netflix is a considerable sum, right? Yeah. So now, and this is what I found just in the last year since we're in the recovery from COVID. The government is looking for any way to collect money that's owed to them. Whereas kind of the last 2 years, they'd kind of let it slide and be like, oh, well, they're not really pursuing. Now they are aggressively pursuing. Like if you're behind on your GST, you're getting a letter. If you don't respond to the letter, you're getting a phone call. Right. So this is like doesn't really, because I don't think any of us are providing Netflix or Crave to anyone, but maybe if you're using an Amazon warehouse or you have a VRBO or Airbnb, you're going to be subject to the 5%, the GST. Now, before I get into PST, does anyone have any questions about it? Not about PST, we're going to get to that, but about the GST portion. No? Okay. Is anyone in a retail trade? Does anyone have retail in your business?
Elaine said we actually have clients that are GST exempt.
Yes, I will get to the exemption rules. There's a fun little slide at the end as to whether or not you charge GST. But I'm fairly certain I know what you mean, Elaine. So with retail, I had said that GST is an in and out tax. PST is a one-time only tax, right? So if you're involved in a retail trade, say you run a grocery store. No, that's a bad example. Oh, here's one. Say you run a children's toy store. You sell toys. You buy them at wholesale from your supplier. You pay your GST on it, right? That's your input tax credit, but you don't pay PST on it because you're registered as PST exempt. And when you go to sell it, you charge your 6% PST, put that money in the account for your liabilities, remit it at the end of the year. Now, the threshold for PST is much lower. I believe it's 10,000 in a year before you have to start charging PST. Now there are a lot of exemptions. Tattooing is one I can think of off the top of my head, as well as some consulting services are PST exempt. But the Saskatchewan government has the program SETS, which is really easy to get set up with, to get enrolled in, and to use. I like using SETS. It's wonderful. You can delegate authority. If you don't want to file your PST on your own, you can delegate someone else to do it for you. Works great. Submit your reports. And they also will connect direct to your bank, so you can make paying them very easy. Now, and this is the story from when I was little. Well, not when I was little, when I was younger, I guess. Everyone loved to go buy stuff in Alberta because it was 6% cheaper, right? Alberta doesn't have PST. Now, as a business owner, if you go out to Alberta and you buy a $10,000 piece of equipment, not a vehicle, because vehicles you have to pay PST when you bring them into the province. But you go buy a $10,000 or $20,000 piece of equipment and you figure, man, on $20,000, 6%, that's $1,200. I saved $1,200. You have to declare that as a consumption tax credit when you file your PST. So it's a self-regulating system where when you go to file your PST, there is a line that says consumption tax, and that's where if you've bought stuff out of province and brought it back in for use in your business, you have to pay PST on it. Now, again, the threshold for PST is much lower than GST. Like if you're doing, and this is tax reported, not sales. So if you're charging more than $12,000, collecting more than $12,000 in a year for PST, you have to do it monthly. Now you can elect to, instead of filing annually, you can do it quarterly, you can do it monthly. They're very flexible that way. The only thing is if you change over to a monthly or a quarterly, you have to remember to actually log in and file it. Okay. Does anyone have any questions so far about PST?
Where can we see a list of businesses that are PST exempt?
There's a link actually in the presentation
Okay.
to Government of Saskatchewan section. I forget the name of this section, but there's a whole section of businesses that are PST exempt. What is a nil return? And a nil return is basically, especially if your business is seasonal, right? So I have a business, say I'm doing yard care and I only work in the summertime, right? And I've built my business up to the point where I got to charge GST and PST. And then, January hits and I don't have any billable income. Well, I shouldn't have to file a return, right? No, wrong. You still have to file a nil return, it's called. Right? You just go in, put your, it takes less than a minute to file a nil return. Log into sets, punch all your zeros in. Yes, I'm filing a nil return, submit, and away you go. You forget to do that. And I've seen in the past where they will let the fines go. If you like, oh, I didn't file my nil return, oh, I forgot. But they can. It's kind of at their discretion whether they chose to impose a fine or not. So returns are still due following the 20th of the following month for your PST. You choose not to file it, you could be subject to penalty. So even though you haven't collected any PST, you still have to file it. Oh, we have stuff in the chat. Oh, will we get a copy? Never mind. Not for me. Right. So keep up with your filing dates, put them in a calendar, put it as a recurring meeting in your Outlook, write it down on the fridge. Whatever you have to do to remember to file your PST, even if you haven't collected any, just file the nil return. And what I found is if you run into trouble with PST, they're actually quite easy to deal with. Way easier to get a hold of than the GST people. Smaller government. And they're happy to work with you. They're happy to be like, okay, well, you're X number of years behind. We'll get you caught up. We'll negotiate some fines here and there. It's easier just to file it on time. Then you don't got to worry about it. Now, and this is a lot of people that ask me, they said, well, why do I have to pay PST on all this stuff? Like I'm using it for my business. Yes, there is no input tax credit for PST. Now, there is, with like I said, with every rule, there's an exception. You can claim exemption from PST for anything that you do to buy and resell. Now, if a supplier still charged you PST, there is a separate form to fill out that's not in a normal return to collect your PST back. But ideally, anyone you're dealing with within Saskatchewan should honor your PST exemption if you have a PST number. Okay. Did anyone have any questions? That is one thing where people get kind of confused as to, why don't I get an input tax credit for all this money I spent? You know, especially when it comes to buying equipment, like equipment's not PST exempt. You still have to pay it. Even though you use it within your business, you can't claim it back. It just goes into the expense, gets added to your capital cost allowance, and you deduct it that way.
What's a contractor clearance?
Contractor clearance certificate.
Mm-hmm.
It is so when you're hiring subcontractors, sometimes you'll be asked, okay, I need your clearance certificate from PST to make sure you're up to date. That's the generalist way I can explain it. But that is a long, maybe a side conversation we need to have about that. Okay.
Sure.
But anyways, when you're ordering items, especially ordering from suppliers, make sure you use your PST number. That way you get your retail items tax exempt, and then you're off to the races. It doesn't mean you can use your PST number to get out of paying PST on stuff that you intend to use within the business. That's not the intent. Okay. Here's some of items that are PST exempt, but I'm not going to read them all to you. You guys can all read and you'll have a copy of this presentation. Now, to charge or not to charge, right? When do I charge tax? Especially, I mean, this wasn't a really hard question 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. Most people weren't into huge online businesses, but now, I mean, you can have clients all over the place. You have clients all over Canada. You can have clients in the US. So selling within Saskatchewan, products from Saskatchewan, and it's being consumed in Saskatchewan, and whoever receives it is in Saskatchewan, charge GST and PST. Selling outside Saskatchewan, charge GST only. And when you sell items outside of Canada, it's zero rated goods. That's where that term comes from. If you're based in Saskatchewan, you're working in Saskatchewan, you need to register and charge or remit PST to the Sask government. Unless you're under the $10,000 threshold, then I mean, you don't have to charge and remit. Okay. Now there are people that are GST, PST exempt. And this list, I borrowed this direct from CRA because it seems like their rules on who is exempt and who isn't exempt vary from day to day. But I'm going to leave this up in the presentation. And it all circles around whether the government, whether it's on reserve, off reserve, band owned, non-band owned, when, yeah, where, oh, who's got a question?
I was just going to say there's a question. If work was done in Saskatchewan, however, the company that is paying for the work is in another province, do you charge PST?
I believe you still would charge PST on that.
Okay, thank you.
But there is a handy link. I'm sure it's in here. If it's not in here, I will send it to Jessica so she can send it out as to when or not you charge PST. And if you need help, reach out to someone. Usually your accountant will have a fairly good grasp of what constitutes GST and PST. You can book an appointment with us through our admin at Prairie Paget. Rhonda will set you up. if you need to talk to someone, you have questions, there's no charge to talk to us. I mean, I'm not going to charge someone for advice, right? They just need a little bit of clarification. That's fine. Okay. And that's it.
Trevor, can you tell me, what if somebody hasn't been charging PST? Like, is there a penalty then?
You mean like, did they register for a PST number and then not charge it?
No, they never registered for one.
Well, how are you supposed? You can't charge it unless you're registered for it.
Okay.
I mean, are you over the threshold and you should have been charging PST?
I don't know.
Yeah. So if you're over the threshold, you can only charge, and this is, maybe I should have put this disclaimer in at the beginning. If you charge GST and PST and you don't have a GST and PST number, and you're charging it, it's considered fraud. Right. You got to be registered. Lindsay, the threshold for PST was $10,000 a year.
So that's services and products.
Yes.
Okay.
You start charging PST after you get registered for a PST number. So under the application, they'll say, well, how much revenue do you anticipate to do in the year? You tick all the little boxes, and then they send you a PST number along with a remittance form. Yes, you only have to charge after you've been issued a number. It's not like, oh, I just hit the threshold. I should be charging PST now. You have to apply. It's not like they can go back on years where you've only made $9,000 and expect you to cough up the PST because you weren't registered for it at that time. Does that answer your question, Lindsay?
What would happen if you don't register for PST?
You could be subject. No, you could be subject to a PST audit.
Okay.
Right. So it's much like, it's called the GST audit, the same. It's not like a tax audit, but they can go. So if you're over the $10,000 limit and you should have been charging PST and you're not, and you didn't register, and they basically find that out, you're going to be subject to, they're going to go back into your revenue and say, well, you should have been charging PST from this date.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got to cough up the 6%. Once you hit the threshold, register for PST. Otherwise, you're kind of rolling the dice on that.
Okay.
If you have any questions, you can also call SETS directly, like the PST helpline. They're great. You can ask. I've come to them with some really like oddball questions, and they'll go through and they'll be like, "Yep, okay, here's what you do, and here's in the PST Act where this backs you up that you're doing the correct thing, and you make sure you just make a note of it." Right? They're great to work with. I like people at PST.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions? Doesn't look like it.
Not bad. We had 11 minutes
That's
to
great.
spare.
No, that's super, Trevor. Thank you. And what I'll do is, would you mind just sending me out that presentation and then I will forward it on?
Yeah, I'll just add in the link to the PST website.
Perfect.
Right on. Okay, everyone, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining. That was great. Oops.
You just want to stay on for a second, Jessica?
Sure, yeah. I'm just going to stop the recording.